Hello, welcome to U.S. News History Today. I'm Haley, your news anchor. Chapter 17, the Progressive Era. It is the dawn of the 20th century, and the reform movement is growing. Moral reformers are trying to ban alcoholic beverages. Political reformers work toward fair government and business practices. Women fight for equal wages and the right to vote. Throughout society, social and economic issues take center stage. As the Civil War ended, increased immigrants caused American cities to grow. As cities grew, new problems arose. Reformers swung into action in areas such as city governments, politics, public schools, and the workplace. African Americans, American Indians, immigrants, and women also called for reforms. Progressivism was a movement that took place in the early 1900s, which addressed the problems contributing to many social upheavals during the 1890s. The progressive movement worked to give people better economic opportunities and to correct other injustices in people's lives. Let's go to Summer for a more in-depth look on this era.
Thanks, Haley. I'm Summer. Well, there are 5 main goals of progressivism: protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, fostering efficiency, and making reforms to state government. The goal of many social welfare reformers was to help ease the harsh conditions of industrialization. The Social Gospel, Young Men's Christian Association, and Salvation Army were all important contributors to this movement. They opened community centers, churches, libraries, swimming pools, soup kitchens, nurseries, and more. Women also played an important role. Florence Kelley worked to improve the lives of women and children and even helped pass the Illinois Factory Act. This act prohibited child labor and limited working hours for women. Moral improvement reformers focused on improving people's lives by changing their very behavior. A common method was to encourage prohibition, or banning the alcoholic beverages. The Anti-Saloon League was a big supporter of this, but Women's Christian Temperance Union created far more change. Not only did they call for prohibition, but they began working towards other goals by building schools for immigrants, visiting inmates in prisons and asylums, and working towards suffrage. Economic reformists saw problems in the uneven balance between businesses, government, and the people. Businesses were taking advantage of their workers and getting special treatment from the government. Some people looked to socialism for answers, while others turned to journalism. The journalists, known as muckrakers, wrote about corrupt businesses via mass circulation magazines. Governor Robert M. La Follette said he would work to drive big businesses out of politics and instead give them equal treatment as he would to anyone else. The movement to foster efficiency also dealt with businesses and factories, but instead focused on how to increase efficacy. Experts began studying scientific management to see how quickly certain tasks could be completed. One system that was successfully introduced was the assembly line. However, these time-saving systems did have a downside, as they led to increased work-related injuries and fatalities due to fatigue. Another method to increase productivity was to make workers happier. Lawyers sought to shorten the workday while companies increased pay. The overall goal was to find some sort of system that made as much profit as possible without overworking its workers. The final movement of progressivism was reforming the state government. Strangely enough, natural disasters seemed to play an important role in prompting change in government. Hurricanes and floods had destroyed cities, and the politicians in charge had done such a bad job that people wanted change. Mayors also worked to create fair tax systems and to get rid of corruption by allowing people to have more of a say. The people got this representation through having the right to the initiative, a bill originated by the people, the referendum, the people's vote on said initiative, and recall, which enabled the people to force officials into early re-election. The 17th Amendment allowed for the popular election of senators, again giving the people more representation. People also looked to protect workers at a state level, especially working children. The National Child Labor Committee organized exhibitions to show children's harsh working conditions. Some states proceeded to ban child labor in addition to limiting working hours for adults. That's all you need to know about progressivism. Back to you, Haley.
Thanks, Summer. As a result of social and economic change, many women entered public life as workers and reformers. Now to Riley for more information on women in public life.
Hi, I'm Riley. So besides eating bonbons, previous to the Civil War, women married, stayed home, cleaned their houses, cooked the food, and looked after their families. In the late 19th century, only the middle and upper class woman could not afford to stay home. Poor women had no choice but to work for wages. This led to women reforms. Susan B. Anthony stated, "Sooner cut off my right hand than ask for the ballot for the black man and not for the woman." So what jobs were available for women? The most popular job included farm work. Women did both household jobs and such farm work, including raising livestock, plowing, planting, and harvesting the crops. Women also worked in large industries. This is when women had better paying options. They began looking for work away from the farms. These were jobs in the city and the towns, but many labor unions shunned them. By 1990, 1 in 5 women had jobs and 25% worked in factories. Most of women worked in the garment industries, where they got paid a half of the pay that men received. Most of the women assumed to be single and not supporting families. Other women worked in offices, stores, and classrooms. Many of these jobs required high school educations. By 1890, there were more women than men with high school diplomas. Business schools trained others, including bookkeepers, typists, and stenographers. Regarding domestic workers, many women were without education or industrial skills. 2 million African American women were freed from slavery but driven straight into poverty by the working conditions that women were forced into. Many of these women went into farm, domestic work, and migrated to cities and became cooks, laundresses, scrubwomen, and maids. 70% of these women that were employed in 1870 were servants. Women started leading reforms due to poor conditions they received. They were forced into dangerous working conditions that jeopardized the safety of workers. There was also low wages and long hours. After the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, middle and upper class women joined together for reform movements. Now, women's clubs discuss temperance and child labor instead of books and arts. As the number of women in colleges grew, so did women's involvement in reform movements, including Vassar 1865, Smith and Wesley 1875, Columbia, Harvard, and Brown would not accept women but set up separate colleges for them. By the late 19th century, marriage is not the only option. Half of college women never married. Regarding the reform efforts, workplace health and safety were a huge issue. Women could not vote or run for office, but tried to improve conditions at work and home. These reform efforts included workplace reform, housing reform, educational improvements, and food and drug laws. The NACW stands for the National Association of Colored Women of 1896, which merged two earlier groups for a mission regarding the moral education of the race. They managed kindergartens, reading rooms, and nurseries. Women were also split over the 14th and 15th Amendments. In the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, women were split over suffrage issues. In 1869, Anthony and Caddy Stanton found NWCA, the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1890, they merged with others to become the NAWSA. The anti-women's suffrage included the liquor industries, the textile industries, and men who feared that changing the role of women in society would greatly affect their dominance. The three-part strategy included convincing state legislators to give women the right to vote, testing the 14th Amendment in courts, and third, the National Constitutional Amendment. In 1871 through 1872, Susan B. Anthony and others tested this theory 150 times in 10 states and in D.C. South Carolina says yes to citizenship, but the right to vote does not automatically follow. So what was the constitutional amendment strategy? Caddy Stanton got the amendment introduced in California, but then it was killed. For over 41 years, it was introduced, but then shot down, and only modest success by the century's end. Thank you, and now shifting this direction back to Haley.
Great job, Riley. As president, Theodore Roosevelt worked to give citizens a square deal throughout progressive reforms. Now to Zach on more of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal.
Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York in 1858. He graduated from Harvard and quickly became a representative in the New York State Assembly. He later served as an assistant secretary of the Navy before running for vice president of the United States of America. After President McKinley was assassinated, Roosevelt took over. He became the first modern president, meaning that he put himself out boldly in order to make fair deals for the citizens, which he called a square deal. He says, "It is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people, and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it." In 1900, trusts, which were legal bodies that held share in companies, controlled 80% of all businesses in the U.S. Many of these trusts were not favored because they used unfair business practices in order to exploit the people. The current laws were not enough to prevent this from happening. In 1902, Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to sue these trusts, which practiced fraudulent business, and in 1904, many of these businesses were closed. Many miners in Pennsylvania went on strike, demanding a 20% wage increase and 9-hour workdays. This was known as the 1902 coal strike. Roosevelt called both sides to the White House in order to resolve the issue, and since none was met, he threatened to take control over the mines himself. Due to this pressure, the mine owners decided to work with an arbitration commission, a third party which settled disputes, who decided that the workers would receive a 10% pay increase and a 9-hour workday, in exchange for their right to strike for the next 3 years. Inspired by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, telling about the worsening conditions of the meat industry, Roosevelt decided to take action. He first sent professionals to inspect industries, and when they came back with disastrous results, the Meat Inspection Act was passed. This required that the meat must be held to a cleanliness requirement before it can be sold to the public. This did not solve another issue with the packaging of food, which was the untruthfulness of labels. Manufacturers would claim that their food or drug could do anything, such as cure cancer. At the time, these businesses were putting opium, cocaine, and alcohol in their products without telling the people consuming them. When this came to the government's attention, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required labels to be truthful. Lastly, Roosevelt took action in wildlife conservation. He set aside 148 million acres and bought 1.5 million acres of land to be used as reserves. Throughout all of Roosevelt's actions, he did not take action in one area, civil rights. This brought upon him harsh criticism, but did not change the fact that he made so many successful changes in economics. Back to Haley in the studio.
Now switching gears to Taft's ambivalent approach to progressive reform led to a split in the Republican Party and the loss of the presidency to the Democrats.
Hi, my name's Sophia. When Roosevelt won the election in 1904, he pledged not to run for re-election in 1908. Instead, he chose his Secretary of War, William H. Taft, to run against William J. Bryan. Republicans had a slogan that reads, "Vote for Taft this time, you can vote for Bryan anytime." Under the slogan, Taft and the Republican Party won an easy victory. As President Taft pursued a cautiously progressive agenda, he wanted to consolidate Roosevelt's reforms. Taft had campaigned on a platform of lowering tariffs. The House passed the Payne Bill, which lowered rates on important manufactured goods. When this was passed, the Senate proposed an alternative bill, the Aldrich Bill, which made fewer cuts and increased many taxes. Taft then signed a compromise tariff called the Payne-Aldrich-Taft. The Taft was a set of tax regulations enacted by Congress that failed to significantly reduce tariffs on manufactured goods. This angered progressives who believed that Taft had abandoned progressivism. Taft then angered conservationists by appointing his Secretary of Interior, Richard A. Ballinger. Ballinger disapproved of conservationist controls on Western land. He then removed 1 million acres of forest and mining land from the reserved list and returned it to the public domain. Gifford Pinchot was head of the U.S. Forest Service under President Roosevelt. Pinchot accused Ballinger of letting commercial interests exploit the natural resources that rightfully belonged to the public. Everyone was shocked. President Taft sided with Ballinger and fired Pinchot from the U.S. Forest Service. Taft's cautious nature made it impossible for him to hold together the two wings of the Republican Party, progressivists who wanted change and conservationists who did not. They split over Taft's support of the political boss, Joseph Cannon. Cannon often weakened or ignored progressive bills. Reform-minded people and Republicans decided that their only alternative was to strip Cannon of his power. By the midterm election of 1910, the Republican Party was in shambles. Voters voiced their concerns of the rising cost of living, which they had blamed on the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Voters voiced their concerns of the rising cost of living, which they blamed on the Payne-Aldrich tariff. When the Republicans lost the election, the Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 18 years. When Roosevelt returned in 1910, he proposed new nationalism, which under the federal government would exert its power for the welfare of the people. By 1912, Roosevelt had decided to run for a third term as president. The primary election showed that Republicans wanted Roosevelt, but Taft had the advantage of being the holder of the office. Republican progressives refused to vote and formed a new third party, the Progressive Party. They nominated Roosevelt for president in the election of 1912. The Progressive Party became known as the Bull Moose Party
after Roosevelt's boast that he was as strong as a bull moose. The party's platform called for the direct election of senators and the adoption in all states of the initiative, referendum, and recall. It also advocated women's suffrage, workmen's compensation, an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage for women, a federal law against child labor, and a federal trade commission to regulate business. The split of the Republican ranks handed the Democrats their first real chance at the White House since the election of Grover Cleveland in 1892. In the 1912 election, they put Woodrow Wilson forward as their candidate. Wilson endorsed a progressive platform called New Freedom. It demanded even stronger antitrust legislation, bank reform, and reduced tariffs. The election offered voters several choices: Taft's conservatism, Wilson's New Freedom, Roosevelt's progressivism, or the Socialist Party policies of Eugene V. Debs. Although Wilson captured only 42% of the popular vote, he won an overwhelming electoral victory and as Democratic majority in Congress. In victory, Wilson could claim a mandate to break up trusts and expand the government's role in social reforms. Back to you, Haley.
Thanks, Sophia. Woodrow Wilson established a strong reform agenda as a progressive leader. Now we are in the Riley Harringane's house, talking about Woodrow Wilson. Can you give me some background information on Woodrow Wilson?
Well, he was raised in a religious family in the South. He was first a lawyer, then became a college professor, university president, and finally a state governor. When he was elected president, he developed a reform program called the New Freedom.
So, what type of reforms are we referring to?
First of all, Wilson worked towards lower tariffs because he saw that high tariffs encouraged monopolies. He supported the Underwood Tariff of 1913, which lowered tariffs for the first time since the Civil War. But with less money coming in from tariffs now, the government needed another source of money. So this resulted in an income tax, as which we know is a tax that gave the government a percentage of all workers' income and business profits. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, is for this. Another area of reform he focused on was the banking system, because it was hard for people far from banking centers to get credit. This was solved with the new Federal Reserve System by dividing the country into 12 districts, each with a Federal Reserve Bank. This system controlled the money supply and made credit more easily available. Setting up the Federal Reserve was one of Wilson's most important reforms.
Also, weren't there antitrust measures passed during this time?
Yes, indeed. Under Wilson, Congress passed 2 antitrust measures. First, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, and it did these 3 things. 1, it made more difficult for monopolies to form. 2, if a company violated the law, those who ran it could be held personally responsible. And 3, it upheld the rights of labor unions and farm organizations. Now, the Federal Trade Act. This set up the Federal Trade Commission, an agency with the power to investigate businesses and to help the government enforce laws. During Wilson's administration, the FTC issued nearly 400 orders telling companies to stop breaking the law.
Wow, these years were years of change. Was there anything else happening?
You'd be very glad to hear this. As Wilson pushed for reforms, women pushed for voting rights.
What did they do to gain support?
Local organizations used door-to-door campaigns. College-educated women joined in reaching out to the working class, and women who had visited Europe adopted the more bold ways of British suffrages, such as heckling government officials. Some protesters went to jail and even started a hunger strike.
Who would you say were the most important figures during this movement?
One of them is definitely Carrie Chapman Catt. She succeeded Susan B. Anthony as president of NAWSA, and she stuck with traditional tactics. I have to say, Lucy Burns and Alice Paul were significant too. They formed the National Woman's Party, and they were more on the radical side.
Was there an event that made Congress finally pass the 19th Amendment?
If I had to consolidate it into one event, it would be World War I. There were so many women active in supporting the war effort. They ran committees, rolled bandages, and sold Liberty bonds in order to raise funds for the war. Once they were active in public life, women felt more strongly than ever that they could have the right to vote. At last, in 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote.
There must have been a flaw in Wilson's presidency. It couldn't have been that perfect.
You are absolutely right. Like Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson backed away from civil rights. He won support during his campaign by promising to treat blacks equally and to speak out against lynching. But once he was president, Wilson instead opposed federal anti-lynching laws. He also chose cabinet members who extended segregation.